Hi, welcome back, everyone. We are going to start on time. Couple of housekeeping things. We have to be out of here at 2:30. The Friday on the Hill is here tonight, and in order for everything to get set for that, we need to be out at 2:30. Also, as a heads up, Professor Leloudis does need to leave right at 2:30 for some other commitments. So please just be aware, unlike our other speakers, he won't necessarily be around to answer questions after the session. For anyone new to the sessions, if you do have questions of him, if you can write them, we should have some paper or cards on the table. Just write your questions down. Myself or Douglas will come around and pick them up and we'll read them. We just find we can get through more questions that way. Let's see here. Is there anything else I need to let you know? If y'all aren't sure what to do after when we leave here, there are some reunion brochures on the table that outline, I think there's bell tower, there's a bus tour, there's quite a bit going on prior to the 6 p.m. kickoff for the Friday on the Hill here. So for our last speaker of the day, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Jim Leloudis. He is a history professor, assistant dean for honors, and the director of the James Johnston Center for Undergraduate Excellence. So happy you had time for us today. In addition to his work with the honors program, he does have an interest in the history of the modern South with an emphasis on labor, education, race, and reform. So I feel like we're really lucky to have him here to look on his reflections at UNC as the first public university. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jim Leloudis.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see, is the first slide on the screen now? Oh, okay. Let me back up. There we go. Good, I can see it at the back of the room. Let me start by apologizing for speaking with you this afternoon seated. It's a bit of bursitis from painting my deck. Somehow when I was 23, that sort of thing didn't happen. But there we go. Well, let's start this afternoon with something that makes us proud. And that's the fact that Carolina is America's first public university. And I want you to say that with me and take note of where the emphasis falls, okay? So Carolina is America's first public university. For 225 years, that word public has been our guide star, but its meaning has never been static. In fact, that word has been defined and redefined, sometimes quite radically, as successive generations have rethought the relationship between the university and the broader society that gives it life. And so what I'd like to do this afternoon is share with you sort of a meditation on the public university. With your indulgence, I'd like to think out loud a bit about the ways that generations of Tar Heels before us have answered the question, what's a university for? And I want to offer some thoughts on how answers to that question might shape our understanding of the university's work today and the university's work in the future. Now, the story, of course, begins in the late 18th century when the University of North Carolina was born the child of an age of revolution. Its founders believed that a public investment in higher education was required to provide leaders for a radical political experiment, that is, the establishment of a republic governed by its citizens rather than a monarch. Now, of course, the meaning of those words, public and citizen, were pretty narrowly construed at the time of Carolina's founding. Only young men of privilege, most of them the sons of a small slaveholding elite, only they studied here. And throughout the first half of the 19th century, the education that those students received was deeply conservative and with a little c, in the root sense of that word. There is the curriculum from about 1835. That's it, spelled out on one page in the college catalog. It was a curriculum prescribed by the faculty, focused on the wisdom of the ancients. And when students came to that curriculum, they did so not so much with questions, but with the expectation of acquiring knowledge that had been passed down through the ages, changeless and immutable. And if you think about it, that approach to learning was well suited to a slaveholder society. These young men who studied here found comfort in the idea that both truth and the social relationships that bound slaves to masters, that both of those things were impervious to time. It was, after all, ideas of change and reform, of what people called progress that threatened to destroy slavery and to kick the props from beneath what was known euphemistically as a Southern way of life. Now, as it turned out, those fears were well-founded. The Civil War destroyed slavery, and with it destroyed what came to be remembered in later years as the old university. In the war's aftermath, in the last quarter of the 19th century, Carolina began to reinvent itself in the model of what we would recognize as a research university. I'm going to slide behind here. This is the first known photograph of Carolina students. This is the sophomore class, I believe, in the mid to late 1850s. But as I say, at the end of the 19th century, in the quarter century after the Civil War, this university began to reinvent itself in the model of what we would recognize today as the modern research university. In 1876, the trustees, pictured here, divided the institution into 6 colleges, each made up of several departments, offering a variety of courses in politics, literature, history, modern languages, and the sciences. And what's interesting here is that this idea of the research university was at this point very much more a concept than a reality. The university was divided into 6 colleges. What that meant is that in some cases, a single faculty member constituted more than one college. But the idea and the aspiration, both were there. And if you go back to the period and you read the letters of the trustees and of the faculty, you'll see that these reformers adopted this new plan to keep pace with what they call the late 19th century's march of knowledge, invention, and discovery. I love that sort of 19th century hyperbole. They imagined that by creating and gathering, distributing new knowledge, that the university would become a stimulus to economic development, very much the way we think about it today. That the university would become the dynamo of an industrial, commercial New South. And those changes in the structure of the university rippled through every aspect of campus life, altered the composition of the faculty and methods of instruction. The Christian ministers who had once taught Greek and Latin here were replaced in the late 19th century by new members of faculty who were trained as scholarly specialists and whose expertise was certified by a degree that was new to America, that was borrowed from the German research universities, the PhD, the Doctorate of Philosophy. And when those professors taught their classes, they no longer relied on memory and recitation. If we were a class in Latin in the old university, this is the way the instruction would have run. I would have given you an assignment last night, perhaps in the orations of Cicero. You would have imagined them. We would have begun class with Nancy here in the front, and you would have recited. When I say recitation today, my students think I mean discussion section. Far from it, literally, recitation. Until you made a mistake or conjured a verb inaccurately, and around we would go, right? It's acquiring the wisdom of the ancients. Students went off to the library and the laboratory. Faculty in their classes lectured, and my students have a hard time understanding that that was a novel progressive invention. But it was in its time. It was the way that faculty brought the latest knowledge in their fields into the classroom. One student put it this way. Here, he wrote, we are taught to think, not to accept theories and creeds simply because our ancestors handed them down, but to think things through for ourselves. During the opening decades of the 20th century, university leaders further enlarged the remit of the public university by directing its work of inquiry and reform, directing that work outward into communities across the state and throughout the South. In his inaugural address delivered in 1915, UNC President Edward Kidder Graham, there's a photograph of him, he outlined his vision for a university that would, he said, provide a program of guidance for the state, one that would lift North Carolina from beneath the heavy burdens of poverty and illiteracy and ill health. Now, as you probably know, tragically, Graham had very little time to implement that vision. He died in 1918, just days after his 42nd birthday. He died in the great Spanish flu pandemic that killed millions at the end of World War I. But his successor, Harry Woodburn Chase, had even grander ideas. At his inauguration in 1920, he issued a call, in his words, to broaden the vision of Edward Kidder Graham by extending the university's horizons out to the South at large. And so it was in the 1920s and 30s that Carolina first distinguished itself as an institution of national standing and reputation by focusing critical scholarship right here on its own backyard in North Carolina, in the South, by setting itself apart, really, certainly among other Southern institutions, by setting itself apart as a self-styled sanctuary of learning and creativity in a region that I'm sure you know as you think about the history of this period, a region that often had very little patience for either of those pursuits. At mid-century, in the decades after World War II, great waves of change swept across this campus again, and once more revised our conception of what it means to be a public university. First, the GI Bill of Rights brought thousands of first-generation college students to campus. Then the Civil Rights Movement opened the door to black students whose exclusion had long mocked the fact that their slave ancestors had built much of the campus and had produced much of the wealth that sustained the university from the time of its founding. And then the women's movement lowered the last barriers to access for female students whose presence here had long been limited and quite tightly regulated. And so what's happening here is that more and more the university is beginning to resemble the society it promised to serve. And as the student body changed, demands for curricular reform followed. Carolina added new programs in African American studies, in women's studies, in sexuality studies, in Latino studies, in American Indian and Jewish studies. And each of those innovations broadened the scope of what we teach and what we privilege and enshrine as knowledge in the university. Now, I know that some hear in that list a sort of recitation of intellectual fads and fashions, but I have to say, when I recite that list, I hear something really quite different. I hear the chorus of a university that today I think one could argue is more open, more humane, more genuinely public than at any other time in its history. In this history that I've recounted, and admittedly I've done it in very broad strokes, I think it warrants remembrance and contemplation because we can extract from it, I'd suggest, three principles that can guide us today through our own tumultuous time. Three principles to guide us at this time when in many ways the meaning of the university is once again up for grabs. So here's principle number one. A Carolina education is a public good and an integral component of American democracy. By opening doors of opportunity for individual students, public universities like Carolina improve the welfare of us all. And that became a commonplace assumption of public policy in the decades after World War II. All right? Think again, back with me, to those men and women I mentioned earlier who went to college under the GI Bill. Those men and women who just a generation before would never have imagined access to a college education. They became scientists and engineers, inventors and entrepreneurs. They put a man on the moon. They eradicated smallpox. They developed vaccines to vanquish other diseases that for much of human history had been relentless killers. They engineered a green revolution in agriculture that fed billions worldwide. And they sparked a digital revolution that has, in our time, put all the world's knowledge at the fingertips of anybody who has one of these things in a pocket or purse. All of that came to pass because of public investment, as I said, in generations of students who a generation or two earlier would never have imagined coming to Carolina. Today, the accomplishments that I've just cataloged, I'm afraid are too often forgotten, and sometimes actually I worry that they're willfully forgotten, taken for granted. So much so that speaking of higher education as a public good these days begins to sound a bit quaint and naive. We live in a time when the market is the holy grail, in which higher education is thought of as a commodity and students as customers. We live in a time when policymakers, by cutting investment, are shifting more and more of the cost of higher education's public benefit, shifting more and more of that cost onto students and families who are buried by growing mountains of debt, right? Shifting the cost of that public benefit, in effect privatizing it by moving it onto the shoulders of students and their families. That, I'd argue, is misguided public policy. And I'd take Edward Kidder Graham as my authority on that fact. He spoke to this in his President's Report in 1916. And in that report, he declared that public funding for higher education, that it should be, he said, the supreme issue of the day. And he went on to say, this is because the fundamentals of democracy have all of their vital roots in education. Equality of opportunity is there too, and there alone. In his view, public policy that ignored those truths, that policy was, he said, empty, misleading, and hopelessly barren. Phrased in a different way, this was Graham's point. Public higher education is basic, again to use his words, both to the future development of society and to the individual life chances of citizens. And for that reason, it's the proper and necessary business of democratic government. Now, having made that appeal to public responsibility and the common good, Graham was very quick to remind students of the reciprocal nature of that investment that their fellow North Carolinians made in them. He said to those students, none of you is truly trained unless he realizes that he does not live to himself alone, but is a part of an organic community life that is the source of most of the privileges he enjoys. And every year, with that thought in mind, I end my large survey course on North Carolina history by asking students to ponder a question first asked of me by Bill Friday many, many years ago. And I promised Bill that as long as I had control of the front of the lecture hall, that I would pass the question along. And it sort of goes like this. I asked students that they reflect on what it means to have been educated at a public university, to reflect on really the magnificent gift that's been given to them and to me by the people of this state. You know, we're privileged to research and teach and learn here because of the generosity of hardworking North Carolinians, most of whom have never been to Chapel Hill and they don't have children who study here. But even so, they rise in the morning and they head off to their job. For some of them, it might be a second job, it might be even a third job, and they pay their taxes and they support Carolina because they think of this as their university. And because they believe that their investment in us here will pay a dividend to themselves and to their children and to the common good. So the question then for those students, and I ask it anew of myself every time, what will we make of that gift? It's not a question about guilt or debt, but a question about responsibility. A question about the obligation to return what we've been given in equal or greater measure. That challenge points to principle number 2. The public university, to quote Edward Kidder Graham's cousin, or I'll quote Edward Kidder Graham one more time and then get to his cousin. The public university is an instrument for doing the work of the world. Now, that's a simple enough phrase, but it can also be a source of great consternation and, as I think you know, a fierce debate, particularly as it concerns the value and the relevance of the liberal arts. The debate grabs headlines today, but there's nothing particularly new about it. In his inaugural address delivered in 1931, Frank Porter Graham, Edward's cousin, took note of impassioned arguments that echo still. He said, "In these days, we hear that the liberal arts should be abolished and university work made immediately professional and vocational, that the public should not be asked to fund any subject that lacks," he said, "utilitarian value." In our time, all those studies courses. That argument, Frank Graham insisted, was a dead end. And I think today his reasoning is perhaps even truer than when he spoke those words. You think about it, our students are heading out into a world in which the only predictable constant is change, and change at an absolutely dizzying pace. I recently looked at some estimates from the U.S. Department of Labor. They estimate that students graduating this year, the class of 2019, are likely in their lifetimes to work in 9 to 10 jobs and as many as 3 careers. And most of those jobs and those careers won't exist today. All right? They will be in fields that all of us here, as smart as we are, when we pool our intelligence and our imagination and our creativity, can't even begin to imagine what those careers might be. So it's more important than ever, right, that the graduates from Carolina are nimble and creative and adaptive. They're going to need the skills learned in a liberal arts education. The ability to pose an incisive new question about the world, the ability to identify relevant bodies of data, evidence, forms of artistic expression to address those questions, the capacity to extract meaning and understanding from all of that evidence, those bodies of data, and then the capacity to convey what they've discovered in compelling prose and spoken word. If they leave here having mastered those skills, they can conquer the world. Now, finally, principle number 3. The public university is a crucible of an inclusive democracy. At its very best, the university brings together students, faculty, staff, and alumni who come from often widely divergent life circumstances, who arrive in Chapel Hill with what at times can seem to be irreconcilable beliefs and worldviews. And the university asks that we be tolerant of one another, and that we subject articles of faith and certainty to critical examination. And for students, you may remember this, that experience can be both unsettling and liberating, right? Because it asks them to set aside to received wisdom, to think for themselves, and often for the first time in their lives, to assemble a system of ethical judgment that's genuinely their own. Does anybody else remember Bill Gear? Yeah, well, I took Western Civ with Bill Gear. I'm not sure how much Western Civ I learned, but it was one of the most valuable experiences I had here as an undergraduate. You'll forgive the metaphor, but I can't think of a better one. I tell people, Bill Gear put a whisk in my ear and stirred it around. And at the end of 15 weeks for him, really for the first time in my life, I felt that I walked out of that classroom with a set of beliefs, with a set of principles, with a perception of the world that for the first time in 18 years was really mine. I had put it together. Now, today, new technologies offer powerful means of advancing that work, and also I'd suggest for undermining it. The possibilities were unimaginable a mere decade ago. The World Wide Web promises a radical democratization of higher education. It makes it possible for us to deliver instruction anywhere, anytime, to anyone around the globe, to populations at home and abroad that otherwise would have no access to a college experience. That's the promise. Those technologies, though, can also cut in the opposite direction. Some critics of the public university, in fact, have embraced e-learning as a means of casting off what they believe to be the academy's political bias, and a way of sharply reducing, if not zeroing out, the need for public subsidies of higher education. They imagine a future in which instructional content will be prepackaged in digital form and offered up for consumption in a marketplace, an online marketplace, where people will pick and choose according to their particular taste and proclivities. One economist who champions that kind of reconfiguration describes it this way. He says, think of this as unbundling. It's like putting together your own vacation to Europe rather than buying the all-inclusive package. I have to say that vision strikes me as radically dystopian. And not because it undermines the traditional authority of the professoriate. It's dystopian, I think, because it would squander one of higher education's great strengths. The capacity to bring us together with people who are not like us, and to expose us to ideas and challenge our most basic assumptions about ourselves and our world. I fear that in an unbundled university, there'd be very little room for what Edward Kidder Graham once called an intellectual way of life. So to pull all that together and offer a parting thought, let me turn one last time to Frank Porter Graham. Speaking to students in 1939, he spelled out what he thought of as the value of the public university. And I think he spelled out sort of the moral of the tale I've spun this afternoon. Here's what he said. We should realize that our American democracy will be more truly tested in what we do about glaring inequalities than what we merely proclaim on the 4th of July. In the college era of freedom, traditions of honor become robust with obligations upon college men and women to help make the world freer and fairer to all. It is the personal and social responsibility of college men and women to give all ideas a fair hearing, to interpret and champion the freedom and rights of despised minorities, regardless of race, color, class, or creed, to offset vested power with social justice. So said Frank Porter Graham. Hark the sound.
If anyone has any questions, please write them down on the paper and cards provided, and Douglas and I are happy to come grab them.
It wouldn't be class without a writing assignment, right?
Who is the Frank Porter Graham and Bill Friday of today at UNC? Or who are?
Wow, I knew you should have let me see those questions. What gives me hope? This is sort of a dodge, but it's a truthful answer too. What gives me hope is that I see dozens of Bill Fridays and Frank Graham and Edward Kidder Grahams in my classes every year. In fact, before I came over here, thought I was going to be a little bit late. A young man who was in a class with me he was in the fall, and this semester was in the program that Honors and the Department of Public Policy run in Washington. It's an internship-based policy on both international affairs and domestic policy. And Sean was back in town and had been hammering away at me on email to get back together. And I wish in answer to that question I could take you back to that conversation with him. As I joked to him, here's a young man who spent a semester on the Senate Judiciary Committee watching the sausage made, and he came back and he said, Professor Leloudis, I'm more committed to public service than ever. So, you know, that's one of those things that sort of sends a chill down your spine and reminds you what a reward it is to teach here, and gives you lots of hope for the future.
Is it a failing at UNC that there are not more minorities enrolled?
Is it a failure?
Failing?
A fail? We have work to do. The demography of this campus does not represent the demography of the state. The issues there are very complex. Some of them spin out into the ways that we fund public education in North Carolina in the 21st century in a way as if it were still the 19th. In fact, in this class I was talking about, I was talking with students about this, and just to give you a sense, you know that in every county there's varying degrees, a significant local contribution to education. The poorest county in this state adds per capita $534 per student to the state allocation. The Chapel Hill Carborough school system, the wealthiest in the state, provides $6,416 per student. All right. Money doesn't solve all problems, but I dare say roughly $6,000 per student would solve some problems, right? And so, you know, kind of distributions of poverty, the demography of the state, they tend to overlay one another in many ways. We have a lot of work to do. in preparing young people to come here and succeed. And also in reaching out to, you know, it is still true in many parts of this state, the students we're talking about here, they know no one who's ever been to Chapel Hill, right? The path isn't obvious to them. And so it's more important than ever that the university take a real affirmative approach to this in reaching out to open doors, to invite students, and to support them here. One of the things that I will say, though, makes me very, very proud of Carolina, and I think here's the good news. It's still true that 20% of the students here are first generation. Think about that, 20%, right? 15% of the students here are Covenant scholars. That's the work of a great public university. Actually, it's sending a chill down my spine as I say it. I hope it's sending one down yours too. That's why we're here. And that's why so many of my colleagues on the faculty get up every morning and whistle their way to work, right? Because they believe in that mission of the university.
In the Research University Theater, I'm not sure what that word, are the undergraduates today getting the type of liberal arts education you espouse?
Yeah, I think they are. You know, we've just gone through a curriculum revision. It's one of those things you have to do about every 10 years. And I'm excited about this new curriculum. I think it's going to center that kind of breadth of undergraduate education more forcefully than ever before. I was heartened as I watched it being put together. This was true in the last curriculum. My colleagues in the sciences were the most ardent proponents of the humanities and the arts. And in fact, one of the interesting things that's happening in this new curriculum is that biology has done this, chemistry is working on it. They're actually reducing their requirements to require more social science and humanities and arts education in their students. I think that's because the faculty realize something that's in plain sight in front of us all, and that is if you look out at the great problems of the world, none of them are going to be solved by a single discipline, right? We're going to have people in places of leadership who can bring the skills and the questions of multiple disciplines to bear on those problems. So yeah, the answer is yes. I think Carolina, you know, as we look forward to this new curriculum, really staying true to that liberal arts commitment. And I should say here, you know, there are only two institutions left, two research institutions, universities left in the country who require that broad liberal arts foundation for every student. Princeton is one, Carolina is the other. Right. Everybody else has an escape hatch for some group of students, right, in the undergraduate population. So we can be very proud of that, I think.
Do you have any insight into original university governance, the first few presidents' experience?
That's kind of an interesting question at this moment in time, isn't it, governance? Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the question is looking for there. Governance of the early university was very tightly held in the board of trustees. The position we now call chancellor was actually a very weak one through much of the early history. I mean, probably until we get to David Lowry Swain, who was Bill 38 years, how many? 33 years president of the university, in many ways the architect of the antebellum university. But in the earlier years of the university, governance institution was more tightly held on balance, I think, by the trustees than by what was called the presiding professor.
How many students were in the first class of 1793? What were the living arrangements in Old East classroom versus living quarters?
Yeah. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and embarrass myself and say I don't know the answer to the first part of that, the size of the original class, other than very small. Old East was, a multi-use building. It was classrooms and living quarters. Their whole, I'm going to sort of answer that by going on a little bit of a tangent here. I'm teaching a course in the fall on slavery in the university, and really excited. I'm going to have 15 great undergraduates, and for the first time, we're going to make a systematic walk through the university's archives to try to understand life in the early university, particularly with relationship to slavery. I think, what we should remember is that life was much rougher than we can probably even imagine it today. Most of the comforts did not exist. There are some really interesting records about how students took care of basic bodily functions. They took care of one, they said, at the nearest bush or tree, and the other behind the wall. Into the woods where South Building now stands. Students came with servants. For students who didn't bring servants with them, slaves. The university leased slave labor. We don't know exactly what those living arrangements were. Some of those people seem to have slept in the hallways and on the floors in Old East, and then the other dormitories built a bit later.
A huge thank you from this questioner. What can we as alumni do to advance the University of North Carolina?
I think maybe I implied some answers in some of the things I said. I really would encourage you, every opportunity you have in every setting, if you know people in power, if it's just friends, to be an advocate for the university. This institution remains to this day and will be in the future so critically important to the welfare of the people of this state. And I think it's important that we find some way across the deep political divides that separate us today to somehow come to a new consensus about the value of this kind of university, of a public university. I worry a lot. I mean, those things I said about first-generation students and Covenant scholars, that's wonderful. But I still worry a lot about access to this place and the thousands of extraordinary young men and women out in communities all around this state who, for financial reasons, will not be able to come here. I'm sure you can think back to what tuition was when you were an undergraduate. When I showed up in 1973, it was $150 a semester. I say to my students, I'm sitting here, in class, I'm sitting here today with a PhD because of public higher education. I would not be here otherwise, and that's true for many of my colleagues. So somehow, some way, I think we have to find a path to that sort of reaffirmation of the value of public higher education and the importance of a public investment in the next generation of young North Carolinians.
Can you speak to the legacy of Hugh T. Is it Leffer? I'm sorry, our legendary historian?
Yeah, Hugh Leffler. Yeah.
Leffer.
I probably should just step off the stage and let some other folks here do it because I did not know him. Actually, if you trace the history of the faculty line I'm in Hugh Leffler's seat. That's a kind of awesome responsibility, right? He and Bill Powell, as you know, were sort of legendary students and teachers of North Carolina history. One of the legacies, is the commitment that the Department of History and this university have continued to have to the researching and the writing about and the teaching of North Carolina history. I don't know of another public university that in its history department has two faculty, dedicated in part of their scholarship and their teaching to state history. I suppose I say that retirement's not imminent, but it's a lot closer than it used to be. I wonder about that commitment going forward. I'm reminded of the importance of it every year when I sit in class with a group of remarkable undergraduate students who, though, are pretty quick to make it known, and sometimes they come to my office and they're a bit angry, how little of the state's history they actually know. That's not a good thing, right? For the next generation, they're going to be the people who go out and they're going to be the leaders of the next generation. They're going to shape the state's future. So I hope the university will carry on that legacy from Hugh Leffler and Bill Powell.
That was an amazing segue into this next question. Do the students today see their role in society as you portray it? Do they see the sacrifice made by North Carolina?
I think the vast majority of them down at a level that maybe isn't quite articulated. They sort of feel it, they sense it. When I ask that question every year, I have lots of students come up after class, send me an email later, write it in a course evaluation, how much they appreciated that question. And again, especially the juniors and seniors saying, I've been here a while, and no one ever quite put it that way. I think there's work we could do as a university. I mean, I'd love for us to start posing that question at convocation the first time our new entering class comes together. They are coming to not only a great research university, but really quite an extraordinary institution. I'd like to see us do a little more work at the university level to sort of to put that and keep that in front of students' line of sight from the outset.
How will the university change in the next 10 years?
Oh, wow. When I look at some of the things going on in the curriculum, students are certainly going to be drawn deeper and deeper into various forms of what we call experiential education. I think one of the most exciting things when I look around the campus is the really quite remarkably large number of undergraduate students who are actively involved in faculty-mentored research. We're in a course like this archival course I'm going to be doing on slavery in the university. They're in labs with my colleagues in chemistry and biology and psychology and neuroscience and medicine, and I could go down the list. So much more of that exists today than existed when I came here in 1973, than existed when I joined the faculty in 1989. I think maybe that's one of the most exciting. When I talk about the skills of a liberal arts education, that ability to pose an incisive question, to figure out what are the important questions to ask and then how to answer them, that's what research is all about. And I think one of the most exciting things, as I look out over the horizon for the next 10 years, is just how much more undergraduate students will be incorporated as real participants and contributors in that work. It was much more a distant thing, certainly, when I was here for most undergraduate students. Technology will continue to reshape the way that we teach and learn, I suspect, in less revolutionary ways than many people imagine. As a historian, I think back to the 1920s and 30s when radio supposedly was going to revolutionize higher education. It changed some things, but didn't really revolutionize it. And then television was going to do that in the 50s and 60s. Educational television's an important part of my life these days, but didn't do away with the university. And I suspect the new technologies won't do that either. They will augment and enrich the things we do. But you know, this is a medieval institution at its heart. It's been here thousands of years. I suspect it'll be here a few hundred more. And I think in places like this, teaching will continue to be a contact sport. You know, that something students and faculty do together in a classroom face to face.
And apologies that we will not be able to get to all of the questions, so I'm going to do one that I think is a fairly quick answer. Could you, evidently some folks aren't aware of what a covenant student is.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So this is a program that was begun while James Measer was chancellor. Shirley Ort was vice chancellor for scholarships and student financial aid. The Covenant Scholarship assures that students from families earning less than 200% of the poverty line, so the poverty line this year for a family of four is somewhere between $25,000 and $26,000 a year. So it guarantees that a student who is academically qualified for admission, who comes from a family earning less than 200% of that figure, so a family of four earning less than $52,000, guarantees that student a Carolina education debt-free. And debt-free through a mix of grants and work study. So those students have some skin in the game too. It was a remarkable thing when it was created. I think in some ways even more remarkable today. When it was created, lots of other institutions around the country copied us. And then 2008 came and they stopped copying us. And in many places it's been abandoned, but Carolina has, you know, held close to this. So 15% of the students today are Covenant scholars. That's why, you know, I'd ask us to say one more time, you know, Carolina is America's first public university. I don't think there's any better expression of it than that commitment to bright, young North Carolinians.
What is the state of UNC's leadership today and its relationship with the BOG? Hopeful, pessimistic?
I figured that question was going to be in there somewhere. Right?
Figured we could end on that one.
You know, I'll say I have, I was a member of the Chancellor's Task Force in University History. I had a lot more to do with some of the things going on in McCorkle Place and elsewhere than I've got the afternoon to share with you. I do hope, though, if you've not done so, you'll go over to Saunders Hall and see the historical exhibit we put there around the changing of the name of that building now to Carolina Hall. You know, I'm optimistic, and I think I have a lot of faith in the leaderships we have in place. I've always admired Bill Roper. I took it as very good news when he was named interim president of the university system. I hope he'll get to stay and that he wants to stay in that position. I think that Kevin Guskowitz was an outstanding choice for interim chancellor. I've had a chance to work with Kevin really very closely on a whole variety of projects from the time he became Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. So things are up in the air at the moment, but in terms of the leadership, I'm really quite optimistic, and I'm not just saying that, you know, to make people feel good this afternoon. You know, I joked about governance issues earlier. I think I can make this comment as a completely nonpartisan comment. I think we have some serious issues to sort out in terms of the relationship of the Board of Governors, not just to this campus, but to other campuses across the UNC system. In kind of finding that line, right, where a Board of Trustees, a Chancellor, senior administrative leadership make policy and implement policy for a campus, where the line is between that and the more high-level kinds of priority setting that bodies like the Board of Governors ordinarily in these situations. So this sort of work that is theirs. That we're going to have to sort of figure out and renegotiate, I think.
I think we might get at least one more, maybe two in. Could you comment on the international experiences of our students?
That, like a liberal arts education, is more important than ever. When I was here as an undergraduate, study abroad was a Toronto exchange. A few people, went really exotic places, like the south of France. It's an essential part of an undergraduate education today. That's true for the students who will go off and make their careers in Hong Kong, and it's also true for the students who will go home to Burgaw and run a business and be on the town council, right? Because everything local is global these days. You're not going to bring prosperity to your hometown unless you understand and are engaged with the world. Chancellor Guskowitz's goal for Carolina is for 50% of undergraduates to be studying abroad. Right now it stands at about 37%, which puts us in the top 5 among public research universities. So a lot to brag about there, still a lot of work to be done. It's an important priority in the current capital campaign. Honors Carolina has quite a broad global footprint. It's open to all, our programs are open to all Carolina students, not just those who are formally in honors. It ranges from Winston House in London to an internship program in Cape Town to literally programs all over the world. And one of the major hurdles, as you might imagine, I'll circle back to where I started with the capital campaign, is closing the financial gap for those students. We deliver programs at a really competitive price point when you look at other providers, but particularly for in-state students, the gap between being able to afford a semester in Chapel Hill and being able to, say, go with us to learn about clean tech in China and Korea this summer, that gap can be substantial. So that's, a project that is going to involve all of us. Those of us who are putting together programs, integrating them into the curriculum, and the broader Carolina community who are committed to opening doors, in this case, doors to the world for our students.
Thank you. I think we're at a good stopping point for now. And again, just as a reminder, we do ask that at your nice leisure, but we do need to clear the room to have the folks come in and get set up for tonight. And then just a big warm thank you to Professor Leloudis for his talk.
The thanks is to you. It is a real privilege and always a great pleasure to come to an event like this. Go Heels.